In 1880, a man spent $800,000 to buy 4,000 acres of empty prairie and marsh 14 miles south of Chicago, and then spent another $5 million building an entire city on top of it. Every house, every store, every church pew, every blade of grass, he owned it all. His name was George Mortimer Pullman, and the city was named after him. And for about 13 years, it was considered the most perfect town in the United States. Then it became one of the most despised. And then, very slowly, most people forgot it existed at all. But here's the detail that gets me every time. The land was purchased in secret. Pullman sent a man named Colonel James to quietly buy parcels from 75 different owners so that no one could figure out what was happening and jack up prices. 75 separate transactions, all orchestrated to assemble a single 4,000-acre tract along the western shore of Lake Calumet, right on the Illinois Central Rail line. $800,000, that's roughly $21.5 million in today's money, for what was essentially swamp. And Pullman looked at that swamp and saw a kingdom. To understand why he built it, you have to understand who George Pullman was before he was George Pullman. He was born in 1831 in Brockton, New York, the third of 10 children born to a carpenter named James Lewis Pullman. His father had a very specific skill. He moved buildings. When the Erie Canal needed widening, someone had to relocate the warehouses and houses that were in the way, and Lewis Pullman figured out how to do it with jack screws and timbers. He even patented a device for transporting structures on wheels. When Lewis died in 1853, George was 22 years old, and he simply took over the business. Now here's where the story starts to gather speed. In the late 1850s, Chicago had a problem. The city had been thrown up so fast on such low, marshy ground that the streets were practically at the water table. Flooding was constant. The whole city, they decided, needed to be raised. Streets, sidewalks, buildings, everything, by an average of 6 feet so they could install a proper sewer system. George Pullman saw an advertisement, packed up, and moved to Chicago to do exactly the kind of work his father had taught him. He formed a partnership and started lifting buildings. His big moment came with the Tremont House, one of the finest hotels in the city, a massive 6-story brick structure. Pullman and his crew of 500 men placed 5,000 jack screws under the building, and, on signal, each man gave his jacks a half turn at a time. Inch by inch, the Tremont rose 6 feet into the air. Guests were still inside. Senator Timothy Howe of Wisconsin was sleeping upstairs. The only way you'd know the building was moving was that the number of steps at the entrance kept growing. That job made Pullman famous and, more importantly, rich. But he wasn't interested in lifting buildings forever. He'd been on enough overnight trains to know that sleeping on a railroad car was miserable. Cramped bunks, terrible ventilation, filthy conditions. And he believed there was a fortune waiting for anyone who could fix that. In partnership with Benjamin Field, a former New York State senator, Pullman started converting old coaches into sleeper cars for the Chicago, Alton, and St. Louis Railroad. They were improvements, but not yet the thing that would change everything. That came in 1865 with a car called the Pioneer. It cost $18,000 to build, an outrageous sum for a railroad car at the time. And it featured red carpeting, hand-finished woodwork, silver-trimmed coal lamps, and folding upper berths. People thought Pullman was out of his mind. But then Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and when the funeral train carried Lincoln's body from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, Pullman's connections got the Pioneer attached to the cortege. The car was too wide for some station platforms and too tall for certain bridges, and they had to modify the infrastructure along the route to accommodate it. But millions of Americans saw that car, and overnight it became the most famous railroad coach in the country. From that moment, the Pullman Palace Car Company grew like nothing else in American industry. By 1867, it had a charter from the Illinois legislature. By 1879, the company boasted 464 cars out on lease, gross annual earnings of $2.2 million, and net profits approaching $1 million a year. Pullman didn't just build sleeping cars. He built hotel cars, dining cars, parlor cars. He created the Delmonico, the world's first car devoted entirely to fine dining on rails, and he had a genius for the business model. He didn't sell his cars to the railroads outright. He leased them. The railroads got the prestige of Pullman service without the capital expenditure, and Pullman kept ownership of the rolling stock and employed the staff who ran it. At its peak, the Pullman Company was operating what amounted to the largest hotel in the world, at one point accommodating 26 million passengers a year, served by thousands of porters and conductors. Those porters, almost all of them African American, many of them formerly enslaved men, are a story of their own, and we'll come back to them. But in 1880, what Pullman needed was a factory, a big one. He had shops in Detroit, St. Louis, Elmira, and Wilmington, but demand was outstripping capacity. He needed a single, enormous manufacturing complex, and he decided that this factory would not just be a factory. It would be surrounded by a town, a complete self-contained community designed from scratch to produce the happiest, healthiest, most productive workforce in America. Pullman hired 3 men to make it happen. Solon Spencer Beeman, a 27-year-old architect who'd trained under Richard Upjohn. Nathan Franklin Barrett, a landscape architect who'd designed estates on Staten Island and in Tuxedo Park, and Benzette Williams, a civil engineer to handle the water, sewer, and gas systems. Groundbreaking began on April 24, 1880. Over that first summer, more than 100 railroad supply cars were unloaded at the site every week, carrying brick, stone, timber, and iron. And here's a detail that tells you everything about Pullman's mind. The brick was manufactured from clay found on the property itself. He built a brickyard on site so he wouldn't have to pay to ship the material in. Before the first house was finished, he had painting shops, ironworking shops, and woodworking shops running, using the factory infrastructure to build the town and then the town to support the factory. Every dollar was doing double duty. The first resident moved in on January 1st, 1881. Lee Benson, a foreman from Pullman's Detroit shop, brought his wife, his child, and his sister to a house at 11,109 South Street, Lawrence Avenue. By April, the car shops were running. By May, more than 350 people lived in Pullman. And by 1884, when the original town was essentially complete, Pullman had built roughly 1,400 dwellings housing a population that would eventually swell to around 12,000 people. Now, let me take you through what this town actually looked like, because this is the part of the story that makes you wish you could walk through a door into 1890 and just stand on a street corner for an afternoon. Every building was red brick with limestone trim. Every structure was designed by Beeman, all 1,300 original buildings, one architect's vision. The houses were row homes mostly, in a restrained Queen Anne style, with high ceilings, large windows, and walls painted in light colors. They had indoor plumbing and running water, amenities that were almost unheard of in working-class housing at the time. Every home had access to a private yard and a paved alley behind it for trash collection, which was included in the rent. The streets were paved, swept, and watered daily. There were fire hydrants on every block. The town's sewage flowed into a massive 300,000-gallon cistern beneath a 200-foot water tower, and from there it was pumped to a company-owned farm south of town where it was converted into fertilizer and sold at a profit. Even the sewage made money. Barrett, the landscape architect, designed the town to feel like a suburban park, another radical idea for a working-class community. Each block of row houses had front yards. Trees lined every parkway. The company greenhouse and nursery down by the shore of Lake Calumet cultivated more than 70 species of shrubs and trees and 125 varieties of plants. The streets themselves were named for inventors and engineers. Stevenson, for the man who built the first public railway. Corliss, for the inventor of the steam engine that powered the entire works. Morse, Watt, Bessemer. You walked through Pullman and the street signs read like a textbook of industrial progress. The centerpiece of the factory complex was the administration building with its soaring clock tower, forming the central mass of a structure 700 feet long. It overlooked an artificial lake called Lake Vista, which served as a cooling reservoir for the massive Corliss steam engine that powered the entire works and provided steam heat to the public buildings. The administration building faced the Illinois Central tracks, so it was the first thing any train passenger saw when approaching from Chicago, a deliberate piece of stage management. Pullman wanted visitors to see grandeur before they saw anything else. But south of the factory, across the tracks, was where the real life of Pullman happened. The public square between 111th and 112th Streets was the social center of the town. At the northeast corner stood the Hotel Florence, which opened on November 1st, 1881. Named for Pullman's favorite daughter, the hotel was a 4-story Queen Anne showpiece, 50 rooms, a wide wraparound veranda 268 feet long, cherry woodwork on the first floor, encaustic tile in the lobby laid in geometric patterns, and furnishings by the Toby Company that cost $31,000 alone on top of the building's $100,000 construction cost. It turned a profit in its very first year. George Pullman kept a suite on the second floor for the days he came down from the family's fashionable Prairie Avenue home in the city to inspect the works. The Hotel Florence had a dining room, a billiard room, a barber shop, separate parlors for men and women, and one other thing that mattered enormously: the only bar in the entire town of Pullman. George Pullman did not want his workers drinking. He banned the sale of alcohol within town limits. But at the Florence, where the railroad executives and traveling salesmen stayed when they came to do business, there was a saloon, elegant, well-stocked, and entirely off-limits to the factory hands. The workers knew the bar was there. They could smell the whiskey. They just couldn't have any. On the opposite end of the public square stood what may have been the most remarkable building in the whole town, the Arcade. Completed in June 1882, it was the largest non-industrial building in Pullman, a block long, covering about an acre, 90 feet tall, and costing $318,000 to construct. If you've ever walked through a shopping mall, you should know that the Arcade was one of the earliest indoor retail spaces in America. The ground floor had shops selling shoes, clothing, china, glassware, furniture, jewelry, and hardware, plus a tailor, a dressmaker, a barber, a dentist, and a doctor. The Pullman Loan and Savings Bank occupied the northeast corner. The post office sat in the northwest corner. The second floor held a subscription library with more than 6,000 volumes, most of them donated from George Pullman's personal collection, and an ornate 1,000-seat theater. That theater deserves its own paragraph. The famous scenic artist Hewson Hawley, a British-born painter who worked at Madison Square Theater in New York, spent 11 weeks painting the curtain and scenery. The interior decor was a blend of Moorish, Arabic, and Persian motifs, with complex arches, intricate gallery railings, and turrets. 5 elegant private boxes lined each side of the main seating area. The orchestra seats were covered in red leather. A giant gas chandelier hung from a frescoed ceiling. To reach the theater, you climbed a massive stairway from the west entrance of the Arcade into a hallway with a sky blue ceiling studded with stars. Shows ran about 4 times a month. Plays, choir concerts, minstrel shows, comic actors, vaudeville. Arthur Sullivan himself, of Gilbert and Sullivan, oversaw a production of his comedy On Guard there in June 1883. Ticket prices range from 35 to 75 cents, considerably less than Chicago theaters. The company claimed it broke even on the theater, though whether that was true is anyone's guess. Pullman personally approved every performance. He would not rent the theater to a third party because he wanted to control what his workers saw. On the southeast corner of the public square, diagonally across from Arcade Park with its geometric flower beds and manicured plantings, stood the Greenstone Church, a Richardsonian Romanesque structure built of serpentine stone quarried in Pennsylvania, with a 92-foot tower, cherry wood pews, and an original Steer and Turner pipe organ. Pullman intended it to be a union church, one building where all denominations could worship together. It was a lovely idea with one problem. He set the rent so high that almost no congregation could afford it on its own. He wanted to force cooperation. Instead, most denominations found cheaper places to meet, and the church sat underused for years, an exquisite building that its intended community couldn't quite figure out how to occupy. By 1884, the town was attracting national attention. That fall, representatives from the labor bureaus of 13 states, along with Carroll D. Wright, the U.S. Commissioner of Labor, came to inspect. Their report was generally favorable. They noted the broad avenues, the parks, the garbage collection, the amenities that working men in Chicago could only dream of. But they also noted 2 things that would eventually matter a great deal. First, rents were slightly higher than in nearby areas. A 5-room row house in Pullman ran about $18 a month, compared to $8 for comparable housing in Roseland, just down the road. And second, the residents had virtually no say in how their community was governed. They couldn't own property. They had no voice in town affairs. The company controlled all media of opinion. Inspectors could barge into homes at any time under the pretext of maintenance checks, and leases could be terminated on 10 days' notice. George Pullman expected the town to earn a 6% return on the investment in housing. It never did. The actual return hovered around 4 to 4.5%. This is an important number because it tells you something about the financial logic under the surface. The town was not a charity. It was not even exactly a benefit. It was a business proposition that was supposed to pay for itself. Pullman believed that a beautiful environment would produce better workers, that better workers would produce better cars, and that the whole enterprise, factory, town, everything, would generate a reliable return for shareholders. For about a decade, that logic held together. The company paid consistent dividends. The cars were magnificent. The workforce was skilled and stable, and visitors from around the world came to marvel at what one man had created from a swamp. Think about what it felt like on a Saturday night in 1888. The gas lamps are lit along 111th Street. The Pullman Pleasure Club is hosting a grand reception at the Hotel Florence. The Tribune ran an item about it, one of those non-news social notes that newspapers used to print. And through the tall windows you can see the cherry woodwork glowing and hear music drifting from the parlor. Down the block, the Arcade Theater is running a show. Murray and Murphy, billed as famed Irish comedians, performing their act called Our Irish Visitors. Tickets are 50 cents. Afterward, people walk home on swept streets past front yards where company gardeners have planted 70 species of trees. There is no saloon to stop at, no corner bar, no place to buy a drink unless you are a guest at the Florence. The town is beautiful and orderly, and if you're a worker, just slightly suffocating. A gilded cage where the guilt is real and the cage is too. In 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago, and Pullman's town became one of the secondary attractions. He even built special apartment accommodations in Market Square for exposition visitors and ran trains directly from the fairgrounds to Pullman. That same year, at the International Hygienic and Pharmaceutical Exposition in Prague, the town was recognized as the world's most perfect town. George Pullman, at 62, was at the apex of his career and his reputation. His company had $30 million in capital. It operated sleeping cars on nearly every major railroad in the country. A French social scientist who visited the factory complex wrote that one could feel some brain of superior intelligence had thought out every possible detail. And then everything fell apart, not all at once, but with the awful momentum of a heavy thing rolling downhill. The panic of 1893 hit the railroad industry hard. Orders for new Pullman cars dropped sharply. Pullman laid off more than a third of his workforce. The workers who remained saw their wages cut. 5 separate reductions between May and December 1893, the last one slashing pay by nearly 30%. By 1894, he'd begun taking contracts at a loss just to keep the shops running, rehiring some workers, but only at drastically reduced piece rates, averaging a 28% cut. The company, meanwhile, continued paying its stockholders dividends at the usual rate of 8% per annum, a fact the workers were keenly aware of. As one worker later testified, Pullman paid the regular quarterly dividend of 2% on his stock and an extra slice of 1.5%, making 9.5% on $30 million of capital. Even as he told his employees, the company couldn't afford to pay them more. But here was the thing that broke the covenant. He cut the wages, but he did not cut the rents. He did not lower prices at the company stores. He did not reduce the charges for gas or water. Rent was deducted directly from paychecks. There was no option to negotiate or delay. And after the deductions, some workers were taking home less than $1 for 2 weeks of labor. There's a pay stub from this period that has become famous in labor history. A man received a check for 2 cents after rent was subtracted from his wages. 2 cents. He framed it. The workers tried to negotiate. A 46-member grievance committee met twice with company officials. At the second meeting, George Pullman himself attended and guaranteed the committee members absolute immunity. The next day, 3 of them were fired. On the evening of May 10, 1894, despite warnings from American Railway Union officials that a strike would be premature, the workers voted unanimously to walk out. On May 11th, nearly 4,000 Pullman employees refused to work. The company immediately laid off the remaining 600 who hadn't joined the strike, locked the gates, and posted signs. The works are closed until further notice. What happened next transcended Pullman. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, had about 150,000 members and had recently won a celebrated victory against the Great Northern Railroad. When the ARU held its convention in Chicago in June, Pullman workers appealed for help. On June 26th, the boycott began. ARU members refused to handle any train carrying a Pullman car. Within 4 days, 125,000 workers on 29 railroads had walked off. Freight traffic out of Chicago was cut by about 3/4. Almost all transcontinental lines were paralyzed. An estimated 260,000 railroad workers in 27 states joined the action. The railroads, unified through the General Managers Association, coordinated their response. They hired strikebreakers. They attached Pullman cars to mail trains, knowing that any interference with the mail would give the federal government grounds to intervene. And it worked. Attorney General Richard Olney obtained a federal injunction. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops over the strenuous objections of Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld. On the 4th of July, 1894, violence erupted between strikers and soldiers. By the end of the month, 30 people were dead in Chicago alone. Hundreds were injured. The ARU was destroyed, and Debs was in jail. The strike failed. The workers' demands were not met, but the aftermath reshaped the country. A presidential commission investigated and condemned Pullman's paternalism. The commission's report described the company town as un-American and blamed Pullman for refusing to negotiate and for the economic hardships he'd inflicted on his workers. One line from the report has endured. The commission noted that the town's aesthetic features were admired by visitors but had little value to employees, especially when they lacked bread. In a separate legal action, the state of Illinois sued the Pullman Company, arguing that operating a town exceeded the company's corporate charter. In October 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court agreed and ordered Pullman to divest all non-industrial property. Every house, every store, every public building had to be sold. By 1909, it was done. The residents who had been tenants became owners. The company town as a concept was over. George Pullman did not live to see his town dismantled. On October 19, 1897, 3 years after the strike, he died of a heart attack at 66. And here is the detail that closes one chapter and opens another. His family was so afraid that disgruntled workers would dig up his body and desecrate it that they buried him at night in Graceland Cemetery on Chicago's north side, in a lead-lined coffin covered in tar paper and asphalt, sunk into the center of a room-sized block of reinforced concrete overlaid with railroad ties bolted at right angles and sealed with yet another layer of concrete on top. The man who had built a city to control the living took extraordinary measures to ensure the dead could not be disturbed. Solon Beeman, the same architect who designed every building in Pullman, designed the tomb. Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln, succeeded Pullman as president of the company. Under Lincoln's leadership, Pullman acquired its last major competitor, the Wagner Palace Car Company, in 1899. As of that year, every railroad sleeping car in the United States was made by Pullman. The company continued to grow through the 1920s. By 1925, the fleet had grown to 9,800 cars. 28,000 conductors and 12,000 porters staffed them. The Pullman name was synonymous with first-class travel. And within the town of Pullman itself, life went on, changed, but continuous. The houses were now privately owned. Residents could paint their shutters whatever color they pleased. They could hang curtains, plant gardens, drink beer in their own kitchens. They could invite guests without seeking permission and stay out past dark without worrying about a company inspector noting the hour. The small freedoms that most Americans took for granted arrived in Pullman only after the courts stripped ownership from the company. The company still ran the factory, still employed thousands, but the town was no longer the company's town. It was just a neighborhood, and for the first time, its residents could decide for themselves what kind of neighborhood it would be. But a neighborhood that was slowly losing its anchor. The Arcade Building, that extraordinary block-long structure with its theater, its library, its shops, its iron and glass roof, fell into disrepair after the company divested. With no single owner responsible for maintenance, the building deteriorated. By the mid-1920s, it was beyond saving. It was demolished around 1926 or 1927. An entire acre of social and commercial life gone. The library collection eventually became part of the Chicago Public Library. The theater, with its Moorish arches, its sky-blue starlit hallway, its red leather seats, reduced to rubble and memory. Lake Vista, the artificial lake that had cooled the Corliss engine and reflected the administration building, was filled in. Arcade Park's formal gardens, with their geometric patterns of thousands of annuals trimmed to identical height by company staff, reverted to ordinary grass when the maintenance stopped. The winding carriage paths Barrett had designed to avoid monotony were straightened out and renamed Cottage Grove Avenue. The landscape that had made Pullman feel like something other than a factory town was quietly erased. Meanwhile, the Pullman porters were making a different kind of history. In 1925, a group of porters invited A. Philip Randolph, a publisher and socialist organizer, to lead a new union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Pullman was then the single largest employer of African Americans in the country. The porters, who paid for their own food, lodging, and uniforms out of wages that relied heavily on tips, had been trying for years to organize. The company fought them at every turn. It took 12 years. But in 1937, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became the first African American union to win a contract with a major American corporation. It was a landmark in both labor and civil rights history, and it happened because of a company and a town that George Pullman had built to prevent exactly this kind of worker power. The connections run deeper still. E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter and local Brotherhood leader in Montgomery, Alabama, would later help organize the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, using Rosa Parks' arrest as the catalyst. When Nixon's porter duties took him out of town, he recruited a young minister new to Montgomery to keep the boycott going in his absence, a man named Martin Luther King, Jr. A line runs from George Pullman's factory on the prairie, through the porters who staffed his cars, through the union those porters built, straight into the heart of the civil rights movement. History doesn't proceed in straight lines, but sometimes it comes close. Back in Pullman, the town continued to function through the middle decades of the 20th century. The factory complex shifted production over the years, from luxury sleeping cars to freight cars, subway cars, streetcars. During World War II, Pullman's shipbuilding division built patrol craft and landing ships near Lake Calumet. The company ranked 56th among U.S. corporations in the value of military production contracts. The last standard heavyweight sleeping car rolled out in 1931. The last lightweight passenger cars, 10 coaches for Kansas City Southern, were built in 1965. The Pullman car, the product that had created the company and the town and the fortune, stopped riding the rails in 1968. The neighborhood, like so many neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side, declined along with the industry that had sustained it. People moved to the suburbs. The factories consolidated and downsized. The population, which had peaked around 1970, began to thin. In 1960 came the worst threat since the strike. The Roseland Chamber of Commerce recommended clearing the entire area from 111th to 115th Streets to build an industrial park. The original town of Pullman, every row house, every public building, everything Beeman and Barrett had designed, would be demolished. But the residents fought back. They formed the Pullman Civic Organization, reactivating an old World War II civil defense group, and lobbied the city. They saved their community. And then they went further. In 1969, the town of Pullman was designated an Illinois Historic District. In 1970, a National Historic Landmark. In 1972, the area south of the factory became one of the first landmark districts designated by the city of Chicago. The residents did what George Pullman never quite managed. They made the town belong to the people who lived in it. The Hotel Florence came close to disappearing, too. In 1975, The building and all its original furniture and fixtures were about to be sold at auction. The newly formed Historic Pullman Foundation stepped in and, with help from George Pullman's own granddaughter, Florence Loudon Miller, purchased the hotel and everything in it. In 1991, the state of Illinois bought the Hotel Florence and the factory's administration clock tower building. Then, in 1998, arson severely damaged the clock tower, a fire that could have been the end of the story. Instead, a $3.4 million stabilization in 2005 preserved what remained. And on February 19, 2015, President Barack Obama personally visited Pullman and designated it a national monument, making it the first unit of the National Park Service in Chicago. In 2022, it was upgraded to a National Historical Park. Today, if you take the Mitra electric line south from downtown Chicago, you can get off at the 111th Street station and walk the same streets where Lee Benson brought his family in January 1881. Approximately 1,650 of the original 1,750 row houses still stand. Many have been restored by their current owners, who come to Pullman for the same thing that drew workers a century and a half ago: the architecture, the sense of community, the feeling of a place that was designed with intention. The Greenstone Church still occupies its corner at 112th and St. Lawrence, though its congregation has shrunk to about 25 members, and it lost its heat in 2023 after utility bills it couldn't pay piled up. The original cherrywood pews and pipe organ are still inside, exposed to the elements in a building that was built to last forever and may not survive the decade without help. The administration clock tower was renovated at a cost of $35 million and reopened as the Pullman National Historical Park Visitor Center, with exhibits on the strike, the porters, the architecture, and the community that refused to let its history be bulldozed. And in February 2026, the state of Illinois announced a $100 million public-private partnership to restore the Hotel Florence, $84 million in private investment, $21 million in public funds, transforming it into a boutique hotel, restaurant, and cultural arts hub. Construction is expected to begin in 2027. The veranda is still there, all 268 feet of it, and you can walk along it and peer through the windows at the empty rooms where railroad executives once drank whiskey, while the workers outside could not. Where the arcade building stood, there is a historical marker. Where Lake Vista reflected the clock tower, there is flat ground. Where Nathan Barrett's formal gardens displayed thousands of annuals in geometric precision, volunteers from the historic Pullman Garden Club tend a simplified version of what used to be. One building that George Pullman never designed still tells his story. At Graceland Cemetery on the north side of Chicago, there's a single fluted Corinthian column and a curved stone bench, elegant, classical, dignified, designed by Solon Beeman. Beneath it, under tons of concrete and steel and asphalt, lies the man who raised the Tremont House with 5,000 jack screws, who built the Pioneer for $18,000, who bought a swamp for $800,000 and turned it into a city, who employed 12,000 people and housed them in houses they could never own, who built a theater with a starlit ceiling and a church no congregation could afford, who cut wages by 30% and continued paying 9.5% dividends, who sent Colonel James to buy 75 parcels in secret, whose workers framed their 2-cent paychecks, and whose family encased him in concrete so the workers couldn't reach him even in death. The clock tower still stands at 111th Street. It was the first thing you saw when the Illinois Central train pulled into Pullman. For a century and a half, it's been keeping time over a place that one man imagined, built, controlled, lost, and left behind. A place where the bricks were made from the clay beneath your feet, and the rents were always a little too high, and the bar was always just out of reach.